So hi everybody, welcome to ONOS TST. Today's primary topic is discussion of the latest piece of infrastructure that was migrated to Linux Foundation, and that is the Jenkins build server. And with us is Andrew Grimberg, who's going to present the details of this and answer hopefully some of our questions that we may have about this. All right, I'll have you take that, Andrew.
All right, folks, seen anything?
Yep. Yes, we can.
Great. Okay, so my name is Andrew Grimberg. I'm the release engineering team lead with the Linux Foundation. I was asked to basically do an introduction to Jenkins Job Builder, which is the system that we use for managing jobs in Jenkins systems. So basically, here's our outline right here. We're going to just go over the basic JJB usage, how jobs are defined, variables, macros, common issues, and best practices. And we're only really going to go into the very basics of how all this works, right? If you want to dive deeper, the best way to do that is just dig into code. So the main components of a Jenkins job are your properties, your parameters, and basically everything that defines your job, right? So all of those wrappers and triggers, the SCM, the builders, the publishers, your pipelines, whatever it is. And what that basically, yes?
So sorry for the interruption. Are you advancing the slides, or are we still looking at the intro to Jenkins Job?
You're still looking at the intro. I have advanced through several slides at this point.
That's why I interrupted.
Okay.
That title page is great.
It's a great title page.
But we're ready for some more stuff, I think. So.
Well, let's see here. Let's see if I can figure out what's going on. Stop sharing. And maybe if I just share it without going full screen on that.
Yeah, maybe. If you're using PowerPoint,
oh no, it's actually Google Slides. So
fine. Okay, we see it now.
You seen it and now? If I advance a slide, does it advance for you?
Nope.
This is the problem I have with GoToMeeting. It never seems to work.
Do you want to send us the?
If you send us the link,
the link, yeah. If you share it, let's say.
Let me share the link. Yeah, that would work.
Yeah, just let everybody view it, Andy, and then maybe that way everyone also can just take a look.
Sure, I can do that
as you work through it. Yep.
Oh, I want that to actually be to public access. Sign in required, can view, save. All right, so here is the presentation link.
Oh, did you send it to the chat?
I put it into the chat inside GoToMeeting here.
Great.
Seemed like the most apropos location.
Yes. Okay. We have it, but I probably need to seize the presentation rights. Okay. One moment. All right. I'm trying to cut that out. For my wife to send me a routing number. All right. Okay.
Go ahead and present it. I'm on. Technically, I'm on slide 4 at this point. So it's going to say the title will be "What is Jenkins Job Builder?" So it'll be one more slide. There we go. So let me just continue my spiel, I suppose. So Jenkins Job Builder is a YAML definition to XML, which is how Jenkins actually stores all of its jobs, right? And what we do with it is we get a lot of the powerful features of JJB is basically that we get templating, and we also get macroing. So those two components combined allow you to do very advanced management of jobs that you don't normally get when you're just clicking through the Jenkins UI. Our largest project at this point is holding just shy of 3,000 jobs in a single Jenkins system. And our JJB definition is probably only, I'd have to go do a line count, but last time I checked, it was probably about 1,500 lines of code total to support that number of jobs. And a lot of that code is actually shifting into a submodule that we're maintaining for all the projects that we support. So the power of JJB here is that the community gets to kind of uplift all the other communities. I'm going on to the next slide here. JJB itself is basically a command line to upload your jobs to Jenkins. So it does linting of those jobs, validation that the jobs are at least accurate in their definitions, and that they can go up to Jenkins. And it also has the ability to basically delete the jobs. The way we run it on a production system is that the Jenkins jobs themselves, whenever there's a job inside Jenkins that actually manages the Jenkins jobs. And verification of code that comes into Garrett goes through a job, just like any other job, we get a verification job. And then when the code merges in, Jenkins picks that up with another job and actually applies it to itself. So it's literally eating its own dog food, which can do some interesting things when you're modifying the job that actually is managing the jobs, because Jenkins will actually modify the job flow if something changes on the fly. So you have to kind of be careful about that kind of thing. So going on to the next one here. There is there's a configuration file for JJB. All of the repositories that we use has an example file in it. It looks basically just like this. And you basically put in your username and your password or token to Jenkins. And you'll see in here, you see the Jenkins opendaylight.org/sandbox. The reason for that is that the other projects that we manage, we have a sandbox system. And the sandbox system has some special properties. One is that all jobs in it are purged every Saturday morning. So all definitions are flushed down the drain. Number two is that it basically can't vote on changes. And number three is it can't publish artifacts because it's designed specifically as a playground for people to develop new jobs. And so for folks themselves don't generally get access to the production system. All that has to go through standard code review workflows. But this configuration file, if it had been granted access to the sandbox, is what they would need to be able to push their jobs to that sandbox to test things out. Moving on. So the JJB test command, basically this is how I do all of my testing with JJB. I do it quickly and locally. It produces the XML files that it actually pushes up to Jenkins and that Jenkins consumes directly. And it basically, you can see all the flags here, but it's pretty much the only difference between this and pushing it up to Jenkins itself is instead of using that test, you actually use update if you're pushing the job. And so, as you might notice right here in the bullet points up above, parameter order actually really matters to Jenkins Job Builder. So the configuration file always has to be defined before you do anything else. I found that out much to my woe many time when I tried to stick it at the very end of the line. So just a couple of things to be aware of there. Moving on. The update command is similar to your test command, except that it pushes everything up to the production system and actually modifies it. If you have your Jenkins INI file configured properly, it will actually also delete out the old jobs. So actually,
Andy, we lost your audio.
Sorry about that.
Hey, Andy.
My head. Yeah. Yep. Okay. Sorry about that. My headphones died for a moment. I was like, okay. I didn't get warning that they were dying. So.
Okay.
They normally warn me. All right.
I'm not sure what part you were on there, but.
No, I have a good idea. I have a good idea of where I was. Updates. By default, Jenkins Job Builder will not delete another job that is in the system. That is actually a separate flag that has to be passed in. It is not currently listed on this screen, but it is part of the help. So that's when you take a look at the merge jobs that we have, that actually executes with the update. So it would end up deleting any jobs that are not managed anymore. So if there's no definition for it, it actually purges that job out of the system. Moving on. By the way, interrupt me if there's any questions. I'm just kind of going really fast here.
Okay.
So this is a basic job definition, right? This is the most pitiful job you'll ever find in the JJB file. And you really don't want to use it. The job definition here itself is basically saying, I want to define a job of this job name. Job name itself has another template that has to be done later, but there's no variables here. You're not using any of the power of JJB. You're just basically migrating your definitions from point and click format to code format. Moving on. The JJB system itself is basically defined in 3 tiers. You've got projects, you've got jobs, and you've got your job templates, right? So the project itself basically defines a series of jobs that are all tied together in some semantic way as a project. The job templates define how jobs actually execute. Projects realize the jobs themselves that then realize the job templates. Moving on. Your basic project and job template, right? So you've got a job template, it's got a name. The curly brace components in here are actually our macro expansion variables. And the way JJB operates is it will look for any curly braces inside single quoted strings. Actually, I think it might work on double quoted strings too, but convention is single quoted strings. It only will recurse down 2 levels of indirection. So you see here in the job template, you've got a couple of variables. The project itself has a jobs definition, which has basically it's calling that job template. And what it does then is it takes from that project, it takes that project name, which in this case is CI-man, and it plugs it into the project name, and the stream it plugs in as master. Now, project name and stream could actually be arrays, at which point what you would end up with, so if you had a project name that was an array of CI-man and foo, and you didn't have any other array for stream, then what you would end up doing is when you push this up to Jenkins, you would actually end up rendering 2 different jobs instead of a single job. You'd end up with a CI-man JJB verify master job in Jenkins and a foo JJB verify master job in Jenkins. Moving on. So your job template variables in the job name, right? So the project creates the job for every one of those. This is basically what I was talking about with that last example that I was just giving, right? You can nest variables, but we can't recurse more than 2 levels deep, as one of my release engineers found to her woe just this week. I'm going to be poking folks to see if we can possibly get an addition to JJB to basically make that a little deeper, or at least configurable for how deep it goes in. So we do have one of the release engineers at Linux Foundation actually is one of the core contributors to the JJB project. So it's pretty easy for us to get new features into it if we think that they are really relevant. So just an FYI. Moving on. And again, to kind of illustrate what I was talking about by creating multiple jobs, right? This one's going to end up creating 4 different jobs. You'll end up with a AAA JJB verify nitrogen and AAA JJB verify carbon job, and similarly, you'll find the ODL nitrogen and carbon jobs here. So this basically is saying we're going to generate all these jobs. We're only going to define a couple pieces of information, and then they all end up exactly the same, except they have these other components in their name, which generally will end up driving other features of that job template itself. And if we move on, here basically it's nesting variables. So your project name is nesting the stream component along with in both cases. It still ends up generating only 2 jobs in this case, but the information is still useful. This is basically how you end up separating. I don't want all of these other jobs to be produced. Now there is actually an exclude form syntax, so you can basically say, I don't want this particular matrix of variables to be valid, and it won't generate those as well. We don't have any of that here in this slide set, but it is useful. We do have examples of that in our globalized JJB system. So moving on. The system does support a single defaults value system. So you can basically have one file that has your defaults that end up basically filling in variables of particular names as if somebody doesn't specifically override them. So it's pretty useful for things that are, all projects end up having to use this variable, but nobody ever changes it, or only a couple projects may change that. So for instance, our build environments all use dynamic build instances. And so we usually define a default build node, which is basically the name of the node or definition of that node that Jenkins will fire up to build that system. But some jobs will end up needing to use a different kind. And so they'll override that specific build node in their job when they're calling the job definition. So moving on. Job macros. Basically, this is how you expand the ability of templates to be even more flexible, right? So it's a template for templates in a lot of ways. They're very useful for repeating common patterns, as stated here. We also use YAML's advanced feature of anchors, which are basically a way of including portions of YAML inside the same file to another location. So you can kind of create a boilerplate of one thing and reuse it multiple times that could then expand into a macro, which then would be used in templates. So moving on. And this is basically a macro definition, right? So in this case, we're creating a macro that is called lfinfra create netrc. It creates a builders section of the job that basically does two things. It has an inject properties here with setting a new server, a new environment variable for that job. And then it's basically calling a shell file that is being included into this, which we can then manage separately as well. And then the job template basically just calls it as it's saying, I had this builder I want to use, now use this particular macro, and that particular macro happens to require a variable of server-id. So you have to pass in that particular variable to it, which then ends up meaning that you end up producing a job that has this expanded macro component. So these additional steps in it, and you only had to define a couple lines of code there, but it's usable in other jobs. So moving on. And that last example showed that there was an include raw escape, right? So the way you basically tell JJB, I want to bring in this text file directly into this location, is you basically say, I want to include the raw and escape it. Now, there is actually an include raw syntax, but as stated here, you don't generally want to use it. It's only used in very specific cases. What the raw escape basically does is it tells JJB not to parse that particular file as well, because if you don't do that, it will actually try to macro expand inside that file. And if you happen to be doing shell scripts, that makes it really difficult for you to do really good shell syntax linting, because your curly braces have to get escaped, and it makes all sorts of weird, nasty things happen. So moving on here. Moving on to our common issues here. A lot of folks will, when they're first starting with JJB, they'll write something and they try to run it and they get a test and it basically tells them that they're missing a variable, right? Usually it's because somebody forgot to quote their variable string, or they're calling a macro that has a definition built into it that they didn't realize that they needed to pass in. And so you kind of have to unroll that a little bit. So unfortunately, the macroing and templating does sometimes cause people to be a little frustrated with the fact that they are having to do that kind of thing. But in the long run, they end up getting a lot of power out of it. Again, we're talking about here the nesting of variables. You got to be careful on that. The mixing the JJB variables and shell variables. This is basically where I was talking about with the include raw versus the include raw escape. So this is the reason why. you basically want to generally use raw escape, with the exception of when you don't have any curly brace variables inside your file that you're pulling in. So moving on, we do have some best practices that are documented. Down at the very bottom of this slide, you'll find a link to the documentation that we're maintaining on that. It is live. It is a living document. We do update it on a regular basis. It is actually goes through code review just like everything else. We have jobs built around it. Jenkins Job Builder itself has phenomenal documentation. The project itself does not accept code patches unless they have documentation supporting those patches. So their documentation is pretty much top notch. And it's pretty easy to get new Jenkins plugins supported as well. So basically take this to heart. This is kind of the best practices we've found over the course of using JJB now for 3 years. And then the final slide here is just basically some the links to the best practices documentation and documentation for other things. I can definitely state that the OpenStack JJB folks on IRC are pretty fast to talk to you if you have questions. So do so. If not, you can always ping me. I'm on IRC as well as at Tykeel or Twitter. So are there any questions?
I assume so. Talking questions for? Okay. Well, so while you have some of the best practices documented, would there be any sample projects that you would point us at kind of the real?
So I can definitely point you at multiple projects. All of the CI systems that we manage for our various projects all use Jenkins Job Builder. So we have a lot of examples. Our most extensive example would be the Open Daylight project. If you were to go out to their Garrett system, which is git.opendaylight.org, the JJB configuration is stored under the releng/builder project there. Most of our other projects, it's been normalized to CI-management, so it's a little easier to find. Our second most major user of it is OPNFV. They do a lot of a lot of things that none of our other projects do with it at the moment. So they do some very interesting things there. What you'll generally find though is that the Open Daylight project tends to be where the forerunner of most of the global settings are coming from. We slowly lift things out of Open Daylight and move them into our global JJB project, which is managed off the Linux Foundation Garrett system under releng/ global-JJB, or you can find it on GitHub at github.com/LFIT releng global JJB, which is listed right here on the slide set. That particular repository is actually the one that is a submodule basically on all of our other projects, and it defines a lot of major common use patterns. Like it actually defines our verify and merge jobs for the JJB system itself. And it also happens to define a lot of very common verification and merge job definitions for Maven and a few other job styles that we have. We're slowly moving in new components for like how we do our automatic releases and community managed releases. So a lot of that shows up in that global JJB, and a lot of it kind of gets built out in Open Daylight initially just because they're so far down the road from all of our other projects. If you're looking for a simpler project, I would look at EdgeX Foundry, which you'll find on github.com/EdgeX Foundry, and you'll find their CI management there. They don't have a lot in there right now because they're actually just getting off the ground, but they are doing some stuff that we don't have in our global JJB yet. So they're, all of our communities kind of do things a little in front of everybody else. And as we see patterns emerging across all the projects, we start bringing that in and normalizing it, and then basically give those templates and designs back out to the rest of the community.
So Andrew?
Yes.
This is Luca. Sorry, we already talked, and then you did this presentation. Unfortunately, I'm kind of slow to understand. So let me step back for a second. I want to understand, if I'm a developer today and I need to create in ONOS my job, concretely, where do I start? So first of all, well, these links with what Brian should probably report even also after, but we installed a new Jenkins, which we can find at Jenkins or ONOSproject.org.
Right.
We created a new repository in Gerrit.
Yes.
TI management.
Yes.
I know there are still some issues. I talked to Jordan, another guy from Linux Foundation today. They still have some issues because we are kind of the first project that uses these on AWS.
Yes, you're correct. We're still running into some issues with getting the Jenkins configured properly for doing dynamic configuration inside AWS, which our global JJB actually kind of requires. We do that for a lot of reasons, but because of that, if you want to use what we're already providing, we do need to actually get your Jenkins to be able to do the dynamics first. So I have the code that's kind of seeded into those 3 jobs that you'll see if you go to jenkins.onosproject.org, since we did switch the DNS. I have not pushed that code up to Gerrit just yet because I'm still trying to work through some of the tweaks that we need related to that and getting the environment working. As soon as I push that code, it'll actually execute the first job set through there, and we'll make sure everything's good, and then we can get that code merged in. So that will actually be where you'd end up going. And basically, I'll make sure that there's a README in there, but one thing that kind of gets people the first time is the fact that we've got this submodule in there. So you basically you do have to clone the repository, but you also have to make sure that you initialize submodules in there, and you do have to, on a regular basis, make sure you're updating those submodules, because we actually release our global JJB system every 2 weeks, along with another tool that is consumed by that, which is our LF tools, which does a lot of our other heavy lifting. We release both of those projects every 2 weeks. And what we generally do is on all the projects that we are managing ourselves, we push out those updates to those projects as fast as possible. So the other projects are generally almost always on the latest global JJB. If not, they're generally only 1 release behind.
Right. So let's assume the system is working, okay?
Yep.
Say tomorrow, 2 days from here, whatever, the system works, right? So we are ready to submit our new jobs. Now, I'm a developer. First thing, let's assume I want to commit a trivial hello world done with pipeline, okay? I just say pipeline because it's something lately we are using quite a lot. Where do I start? What do I do? So I assume I should download something on my laptop, right?
Well, so actually the documentation, the best practices, let me, if I remember correctly, we actually have, and do we actually have this in there? So that link to the best practices goes to basically a lot of what I just discussed. And if I remember correctly, we actually have information on setting up. No, I don't see that in here.
You know, of course, it's important to know where the documentation is, right? Because
right.
We'll write it to read it, but I'm just looking for the general to the high level workflow.
Well, so what I can do is I could point you at like the Open Daylight documentation. We're actually working on, we have a new project we're just bringing online to actually improve the documentation across the board, so that some of the stuff that all of our communities are basically copying from each other gets moved into a single central location. One piece of which is that, how do I set up my environment to do testing with Jenkins Job Builder? And what I do is I install a Python virtual env and then basically pip install Jenkins Job Builder. It is a Python project, and I use the latest version. JJB 2 is right around the corner, and they've been saying that now for about a month though, but it's right around the corner. So that's how I actually do my testing, is inside a virtual env. I just activate that virtual env, and then I just use the JJB commands themselves. And
so I think what Luca's trying to get at here is like just the high level picture. So one is you need to have JJB installed via pip. You can put it in a virtual environment on your laptop. You have to clone the CI management project. That's
You'll
where
need
the
to
files go.
Yeah, and you'll also have to make sure that when you clone it, you set up submodule initialization.
An update. And then you'll do your job definition in YAML. And then if you want to test this thing, if we get a sandbox set up, then you'll be able to push it there. Once you
Correct.
have it there, test it in the sandbox, looks good, then you'll push the YAML files up for code review. We'll get
Correct.
review. And then as soon as that goes in, as soon as the push goes into Garrett, it'll get verified by the production Garrett to see if it passes the various linting checks, whether the job is valid and compiles, whatever. And then from there, once it gets +2 and submitted, then it will automatically be deployed onto the production Garrett and be a job that runs based on whatever triggers.
Correct. Correct. Now, one of the things that actually just happened in literally our latest release of Global JJB is we added a new job, which was basically a JJB publish, which links your production Jenkins system to a sandbox system so that people can push their job definitions to Garrett for code review. And then they can basically leave a comment in Garrett saying that they want to publish a particular job to the sandbox, and it will actually do that heavy lifting and making sure it gets into the sandbox for you. So technically, if you had that entire setup in place, you wouldn't actually have to have JJB installed locally. You'd be able to just use the environment itself to do that for you.
So you could just write the YAML files and then push to Garrett for code review with a comment that says test on sandbox or something.
Yeah, basically. Well, what it would copy it over to the sandbox, at which point you'd still end up having to go in and manually execute it in some fashion. But yes.
We mentioned multiple times the sandbox. I know we still don't have it. That will come in the next days as well.
That's a question I have to direct over towards Rudy.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that's
something
after
why.
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead,
Go ahead.
Rudy.
Okay, that's something that will come after we sort out the EC2 components of this, but it can come, following the that work.
Yeah, sounds good. Because it seems something like almost a must-have, right, to develop new builds. I mean,
It's not a must-have, but what we found is that it's an extremely good to have.
Yeah.
What we found when we first implemented the sandbox in Open Daylight was that the acceleration of the velocity of the job definition changes and creation at least tripled, if not quadrupled. So we went from people kind of noodling over things and and just going through code review and hoping that they worked properly to a major acceleration in job definition creation and testing. In fact, the Open Daylight sandbox is almost as utilized as our production system in a lot of cases, where sometimes it's actually more heavily utilized than our production systems.
And I believe once the EC2 stuff is working and all of this is ready in the new production instance, there will be some examples in that CI management repository that.
Yeah, you will have the basic JJB verification and jobs in verification merge and the new published job actually. If you were to go to the Jenkins system, you'll see all three of those jobs there, but they'll be fully syntactically correct for the environment once we have everything worked out.
Cool. So that'll give people something to look at while we get the sandbox spun up as
yes. Well. And as I mentioned before, if you want to go kind of find out how other communities are using JJB, go dive in. Open Daylight uses it extensive, majorly. I mean, they're just shy of 3,000 jobs in the system. ON.Lab is a little under, it's approaching 1,000 jobs at this point. And OPNFV has got, I don't remember how many at this point either, but all of our projects are using it. They're using it in various different ways. Nobody's currently using it for pipeline, but pipeline is supported by JJB. So you'll be, this would be their first experience of seeing people actually using it for doing pipeline work.
I was just going to ask about pipeline. Is because I see a lot of overlap here between what you can do in JJB and what you can do in pipeline. For example,
Yes.
Pulling things out of source code management. It appears the big advantage is the templating. Is that what you guys are thinking about?
That's the biggest thing that we utilize this for. Yes. In fact, right now nobody uses pipelines because we have gotten so good at using JJB that we can do basically anything that somebody wants to do in pipeline with standard free with basically the freestyle job sets and just kind of some additional linking between those jobs.
Yeah, I mean, the point is there is a lot of overlap. I mean, the basics of pipeline is you define a bunch of different steps and then you link those together into a job.
Yes.
Pipeline, you do that via something called a Jenkins file, which lives in your source tree. With JJB, it's a YAML definition that sits outside or in different source tree. I guess the one thing the one advantage, I guess, of pipeline that we've seen so far is the ability to run multiple steps in parallel. I don't know if JJB supports that in a single job. You need to have multiple jobs, right?
So if you're doing things without using the pipeline component, yes, then you end up having to define a lot of different jobs.
Yeah.
JJB itself actually supports pipeline natively, so you can actually, if you can define it in JJB, yeah. So you can actually lift what you're currently doing into JJB. It's just a minor rewrite of how you're actually doing things. The big advantage here is that you no longer have to worry about, did somebody misclick something in that UI? In fact, the way we currently have your Jenkins set up, nobody actually has the ability to go in and modify anything except for the system administrators. And right now, we at LF, the release engineering team, we don't touch jobs directly. We always go through JJB at this point, which means everything we do is code reviewed. And that's the big benefit here, is that your jobs themselves are code reviewed instead of somebody going in and modifying the UI, and then basically the only thing that you have that shows history of that is the history plugin from Jenkins.
Yeah, I think that, yeah, what will end up happening is, at least for the pipeline-based jobs, there'll be a really simple YAML file which says job name, and then it says it's a pipeline job, and here's the Jenkins file location.
Yeah.
The reason we kind of have converged on pipeline is a lot of the same reasons you're mentioning for why, you've gone, what the advantages you've gotten out of JJB. It enables you to have reviewed job definitions. It allows you to have multiple stages, linking between those stages. I think the other thing that people seem to really like with pipeline is the UI that it gives you for a single job. It shows you kind of each step, what the success of each step is, how long each took, and yeah, it's similar in the sense that.
And the Jenkins file lives inside the same repository where the code is, right?
Yeah, so that if you have two different branches, if you have a support branch and a new branch, and the way of building or verifying is different on those two branches.
Which is the case for example.
For Cord, yeah, Cord 2.0, 3.0, 4.0, all built in different ways.
Yeah, well, the slide sets kept saying this particular variable of stream. That's actually how we end up going about those various different job styles. Sometimes we end up breaking it apart so that we follow particular branches, our streams as we call them, and then the job, you basically have a job for any branch that you were working on at that time.
Right.
It does mean that there's a lot of jobs in your system with the way we're currently doing things versus how pipeline can basically kind of simplify that down to a few jobs that happen to be very dynamically configured. But
yeah, I mean, I think they'll work well together, and it's just a question of the right balance of what goes into JJB YAML definition and what goes into pipeline definition.
yeah, basically what goes into the JJB definition is anything that you would do inside the Jenkins UI right now. And after that, it's one of the other things that we've got in here is that because if you're when you're using our global JJB components, what you end up with is we start enforcing a lot of code linting on things and better practices. So trying to change things against the JJB definitions themselves will actually enforce very specific and strict YAML linting on folks. It'll also enforce very strict documentation styles on any documentation that shows up in the repository. And that's just kind of an outgrowth of what we've kind of found that we kind of, it's a little bit of a stick to the community, but it ends up causing them to produce better code and better documentation.
And I think, sorry, Andy, I think this is the right link for the Open Daylight JJB information.
It looks like it.
The GitWeb link there, if people want to see that.
Yes, that is.
In the chat. What? In the chat. Okay, I assume.
Yeah, it's in the chat.
This is probably our most scary tree of them all. And I will definitely say this tree is not nearly as clean as some of our other trees. Like, so for instance, our the tree that we've got for Edgex Foundry, which is a small one right now, is our cleanest because it's the newest one that we've set up recently outside of what we're doing for you right now. And so some of the best practices that we've learned over time have kind of bubbled into those other projects. Let me go ahead and give the one to Edgex Foundry as well. So there's the Edgex Foundry one. It's much smaller. Actually, you probably want directly into the JJB itself. What you're not seeing here is some of the stuff that happens in our global system. The global JJB, we make a lot of use of YAML anchors, which, as I mentioned earlier, allows us to do a lot of boilerplating that's not necessarily a macro. Basically, it allows us to inline YAML in certain locations, which is kind of necessary for us because we're supporting not just Gerrit systems, but also GitHub systems with this single repository, which allows us to basically create job definitions that support both Gerrit and GitHub with very minimal differences between the jobs by using both macros and anchors.
Okay, any other questions? I'm sure we're gonna probably.
Everybody has questions when they first start working with it, believe me.
Exactly, yeah, and so that's probably when when you'll hear from us on the IRC channel.
Yeah. The easiest channel to find myself or other release engineers would be on Freenode. We have a release engineering channel there. It's pound LF-releng. You'll find us in there. We're on several other channels as well, but we're trying to consolidate a lot of the JJB knowledge from all of our projects to a single channel. So some of the other communities are going to start showing up in there probably in the fairly near future, and some of our best JJB users will end up showing up there to also be useful, so to be a location where you can basically ask questions. So basically that would give you two primary channels you can go to. You can go to the OpenStack JJB, which, believe me, they're very good about this because they're the ones that produced this project originally, or you can come to our channel and talk to us directly.
All right, cool. All right, well, I guess if there's no other questions online.
So I have, if the sort of tutorial and overview is over, I actually went through our Jenkins and I have a whole list of all the jobs we have and some tentative migration. Yeah. So maybe I could spend like 5 or 6 minutes presenting that.
Perfect. Let me give you the presentation right here. You're not online? Oh, there you are.
I should be able to just take it.
Right.
It's feasible.
I don't know. I don't.
Because the other window is not open, right?
Where would it be? At the end of the desktop. You're not even seeing the little window. Okay.
So I have a spreadsheet linked from the TST meeting notes here, which contains all the jobs that are currently in our Jenkins and on Jenkins 2. There are a substantial number of Garrett validation jobs, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, at least 6. We should probably have more, at least one for each of the projects we have in Garrett, and this is probably a pretty good opportunity for a template and a matrix. There may be some differences about how each of these gets built and verified, but yeah, well, that might be a good opportunity to explore that. We also have some Maven Canary builds, which we should probably migrate for the near term. Or we should work with the build brigade to figure out when the Maven stuff is going to be deprecated, because it might just make sense to let it die with this Jenkins.
I agree.
We've also got jobs that are responsible for doing periodic nightly builds or periodic during the day, every 15 to 30 minute builds that publish artifacts to things like snapshot repos. And we've also got jobs that do some sonar reporting. So I think what makes sense is for each of these types of jobs to have some sort of job template so that other projects can take advantage of the jobs that we have on the main ONOS project. This will also help, if and when we start to do more code-based disaggregation. But yeah, basically it's the orange or yellowish jobs that would need to get migrated, and that's about 14 jobs. And this might be a good opportunity for us to do some restructuring as well. So I don't know how we want to sort of assign, schedule, divvy up the work of doing this. It seems like we can't get started immediately anyway.
Well, it seems like maybe you should go depth first rather than breadth first, because then you're just gonna be refactoring a lot of jobs same time as you learn the process, right? So I would start with some of the most critical ones, which is the carrier validation job, perhaps for the latest branches, before we worry about obsoleting all the other ones, and then master perhaps. Right?
Yep.
And QA clearly has their own seed of which would be treated independently, at least for now. I think progress on those meaning should be treated independently.
So, I mean, that's a good point for the QA folks. I mean, you guys currently run a different Jenkins entirely, which I haven't even put on here, and I don't know how many jobs are on there. 30 plus jobs.
We just moved to pipeline, so it's like
five jobs. Okay, because yeah, it might make sense for you guys to consider moving over to this Jenkins as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, we already talked about this. It was already in the plan.
Okay. Well, so if you've migrated already to pipeline, all of them, then it should be hopefully fairly straightforward, right?
Yeah.
You can basically use the JJB as basically just an invocation of the pipeline.
Yeah, I'd say the first step could be leave the pipeline jobs as they are and just do the UI part with JJB, and then when that works, we figure out what aspects of that.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's
Is that it?
pretty much it. Yeah, I just wanted to point people to this status doc, and if we want, we can keep a doc like this up to date. I don't know how obvious it will be, but the one thing that we want to be able to do is, we're going to run the existing Jenkins, which is now called Jenkins Old, until the migration is finished.
Do we have any goals for the migration to be complete?
So we said at the beginning, we say Thanksgiving, I mean, I would say let's start to see when the system is up for real, because we were assuming it was already up, but it's not. I don't know, and let's migrate to the first job that we were talking about. Let's see how it goes.
No, I understand, but at least to give a tentative date. So it sounds like Thanksgiving would be a tentative.
I don't know. I would assume, but let me know what you think, that by this year we should absolutely move to the new system, right?
Hope that we move to it reasonably swiftly, yes. Because I mean, for a couple of things, right? The sort of the cost of the maintenance and the cost of actually paying for it.
Exactly. So the real point is that, I mean, there will be always, I know there will be always something high on priority. If we don't put a deadline, people will just say, I'll think to this tomorrow, right? And so I think we should just all agree on a deadline.
Which is why I was hoping, to kind of do that first, just with a couple of jobs.
Yeah.
First, and then try to get those done as quickly as possible, perhaps within a week or two.
Yeah.
And then see how that goes. And I think based on what we've learned from that, we should be able to better assess the speed at which we can move through the rest of the jobs.
I think so. Yeah.
And probably after that.
Yeah, Cord, we talk in another moment. That will be a bigger thing. Yeah. One step at a time.
All right, the link to this is in meeting minutes. This document, can you add the link?
Yeah, it's already in the meeting.
Perfect. All right, well, thank you very much, Andrew. It was a really useful information, and I'm sure you'll hear from us again as we have more questions.
I'm sure I will.
Thank you.
Yep.
Your confidence is not reassuring.
It's a learned response at this point. Everybody that has touched JJB for the first time ends up with some questions. So there is a bit of a learning curve there. I will not hide that from you. But once you get over that learning curve, you'll find that it's extraordinarily powerful and very useful. I can say this: we had a community member in Open Daylight when we first switched, or were switching to JJB, that was extremely against it, just because it was like brand new. He didn't, he was scared by it. As soon as his project had switched to using it, the power of it kind of was realized to them, and they became probably our biggest proponents of it. So it was pretty fun there.
Well, you're certainly not gonna find such reluctance here. I mean, we've experienced enough problems dealing with things manually, so we're actually looking forward to this. So, but there will surely be questions.
Yeah.
So thanks again.
Sure.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.